All right, welcome to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, John Davidson, political editor at the Federalist. I'm joined today by Mario Loyola, a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Mario, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, John.
Mario, I wanted to talk to you about an article that you wrote for National Review back in June that addressed a lot of the things that we're seeing constantly in the news cycle right now about racism, about systemic racism, and the supposed problems that we have in our institutions with racism, particularly in our law enforcement in this country, that has been the subject of all this unrest and all these riots. In this article for National Review, it was titled "I Accuse," you talk about the propaganda strategy behind the claims of racism by Democrats and the left. And I wonder if you could just quickly unpack for me what you mean by the propaganda strategy behind these claims.
Well, so what made me think of the article, what made me think of the idea for the article was thinking about how the Cuban communists used their propaganda strategy, which is based all around the U.S. embargo. Of course, the embargo in the first few months of the embargo back during the Eisenhower-Kennedy administration, the embargo was a blockade. But the blockade only lasted a few months. It was an actual naval blockade that was meant to keep, at one point during the Cuba Missile Crisis, it was meant to keep any Russian ships from approaching Cuba that might have missiles on board. But the blockade only lasted a few months. However, there have been economic sanctions where the U.S. can't trade with Cuba. The Cubans refer to this as a blockade still, and the reason they do that is because they use it to cover up all of their failures. They blame everything, and the fact that the power's always out in Havana, the fact that you can't, you're not allowed to use electric toasters because the power will go out in the city. All of this they blame on the Yankee imperialists and on the supposed blockade. But it's not just an excuse to cover up their failings. It's also an excuse for further exactions, further privations, and further tyrannical government. And so for me, I think that the parallel is pretty exact. I think that whether intentionally or not, these indiscriminate accusations of racism that progressives are now hurling against everybody who disagrees with them about anything covers up their own responsibility for a lot of the problems that they're complaining about, whether they're aware of that responsibility or not. And they're also, as you can see in the demands of Black Lives Matter movement and people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they're using those charges to ask for still more power.
Right. And you cite a couple examples of this in terms of failures of progressive policies. And I want to zero in on one and talk about it because I think it's a really potent example. And that's the example of Eric Garner, who was arrested in New York City for selling loose cigarettes. And of course, infamously died at the hands of police during an arrest that you argue and others have argued should never have happened. In other words, the police really should never have been involved in trying to stop Eric Garner from selling loose cigarettes. And you cite that as an example of the kinds of policies that create the sorts of interactions that we're hearing are now racist, but really are the consequence of progressive policies. Is that right?
Right, of course. The police in Eric Garner's case, obviously we're not targeting Eric Garner because he was Black. They have no interest in targeting people because of their race. They don't even want to be enforcing these dumb laws against loose cigarettes in the first place.
Right.
They weren't doing this because they like enforcing those laws. They weren't doing this because they like hassling people that aren't really doing anything wrong on the street just because Mike Bloomberg decided to raise the fine on loose cigarettes. And so I think that the thing that people don't realize is that it's not the police who decide when and where and over what to confront people. Right. They're required by law to do this stuff.
Right.
And so you have to start by asking, what are the laws that are in place that set up these confrontations? Because once you set up a confrontation with the police, and once you've put the police in a situation where they have to make a felony arrest, the police are required to use deadly force if necessary to effectuate that arrest. Right. So you're bringing to bear, when you make something a felony, you're bringing to bear the entire power of the state. You're bringing to bear its monopoly of force. You're bringing to bear its monopoly of legitimate violence. And you're setting up a confrontation like that where if somebody resists arrest, they could get seriously injured or killed. And so to start the story where it should begin is with Mayor Bloomberg, who many New Yorkers refer to as Nanny Bloomberg, who always thinks that the government knows what's best for you better than you do yourself, decides, first of all, to make cigarette smoking illegal in bars and restaurants in New York City, which I lived in New York City. I thought that in and of itself seemed impossible to me when I lived there. Right. And then, of course, as soon as he does that, he also raises the tax on cigarettes to something like $15 a month, which is deeply regressive. So naturally, because New Jersey doesn't follow suit, a lively black market springs up where people go across to New Jersey, buy cigarettes for $6 or $7 a pack, then come and sell loose cigarettes in New York City, where there's now a great market for them, given how highly taxed cigarettes are under Bloomberg. And then what happens is that Bloomberg raises the fine, the mayor colludes with the state government to make selling loose cigarettes a $10,000 fine, which on a second, if you have a prior conviction or it's your second time, requires jail time. So now you get thrown in jail for selling loose cigarettes under Nanny Bloomberg. I mean, that's what sets up a violent confrontation with the police. That's what quite reasonably leads Eric Garner to think that that this is a bullshit reason to be arrested in the first place. Right. And he's not going to be arrested and go back to jail. Right. And now he's dead. And right. The one thing you can criticize a lot in that whole chain of events, but the one thing you cannot criticize about it was systemic racism, because that's not an example of systemic racism.
Yeah, exactly. And this example is sort of this is just one particularly dramatic example because he ended up dying and it ended up getting caught on camera. But you can think of dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of different policies across the state and municipal levels where this kind of plays out over and over. In fact, you could apply the same analysis that you just described to the George Floyd situation. Why were the cops originally called on George Floyd? Because he was trying to use a counterfeit $20 bill at a bodega to buy cigarettes or to buy something, right? And so they called the cops in because he was trying to pass a fake 20. Now, whether or not you should call the cops in for passing a fake 20, I think is something reasonable people can debate about. Like, should the first response be to call in the police to make an arrest, right? And we've seen the footage, not just the footage of George Floyd's arrest with the officer's knee on his neck, but the body cam footage of the initial encounter when they pulled him over when he was in his car. And the chain of events that unfolds is exactly as you described, a series of escalations that ends with a bit of a struggle, some physical grappling, a knee on the neck, and now what was a minor infraction has turned into a deadly confrontation. So the frustrating part of it, as you say, is the left will ignore all that, and they kind of it's like a shortcut. And that's to circle back to your comparison with the Cuba blockade, that they're shortcutting their responsibility for all of these policies and the chain of events that these policies set in place by simply saying, oh, the cops are racist. The cops are racist. And that's why this is happening.
And I don't mean to imply that trying to pass off counterfeit bills shouldn't be a felony.
Right.
I mean, we clearly have, this society clearly suffers from overcriminalization. Texas Public Policy Foundation, where you and I first worked together as colleagues, is famous for something that apparently Kamala Harris is now taking credit for, which is the great nonviolent offender reforms that dramatically reduced the prison population of Texas under Governor Rick Perry, which reforms were many years later taken up by the Holder Justice Department under President Obama and used as an example of what states should do around the country, which is apparently how Kamala Harris got signed on to an idea that was originally Rick Perry's and Brooke Rollins, right? Who I think has just been named domestic policy advisor to President Trump, our former boss at TPPF. Anyway, there may be a lot of overcriminalization, but clearly we have to have felonies. And clearly when arrests need to be made for those felonies and the police have to be able to bring to bear the state's monopoly of violence in those. I mean, when you're getting arrested for a felony, you should not be under the impression that you can resist arrest and not risk serious injury to yourself. I've never been under that impression. I don't understand how anybody could be under that impression. But I think it's very clear to point out that if you're being arrested for a felony, do not resist arrest. And there are clearly many crimes that merit being resisted for a felony. And I think that passing counterfeit bills off is an example of something that is legitimately a felony arrest. But there's a whole other level of, I think, social responsibility here for what progressives themselves call systemic racism, for what Black Lives Matter activists call systemic racism, which is when you look let's leave aside those specific examples of Eric Garner and George Floyd, and let's look at the overall problem of crime rates. The racial disparities in crime rates are not just real, they're astonishing. In New York City, according to the NYPD reports that are released regularly under Mayor de Blasio's NYPD, they're broken down because Americans are obsessed with racial categories. Everything is broken down into racial categories. So these statistics are broken down into racial categories. So Black men, who are approximately 11 or 12% of the population of New York City, account for 70% of every category of violent crime, from assault, rape, assault with a deadly weapon, home invasion, armed burglary, murder, attempted murder. It's 69, 70, 71, amazingly consistent numbers from year to year and across categories of violent crime. And these start with the victim's 911 calls. It's 70% of the 911 calls. It's 70% of the arrests. It's 70% of the prosecutions. It's 70% of the convictions. And so you have a really terrifying, a really tragic number of Black men in prison at any given time, and a very high number of Black men have criminal convictions. And that's a problem, and it's a problem that the society needs to face up to squarely. There may be it may be the result of systemic racism, depending on how broadly you define that term, but it's very hard to believe. I mean, it's not the result of racism in the justice system. I mean, because just think about it. If the reason why the police are spending so much time in poor neighborhoods, many of which are Black neighborhoods, is that that's where the 911 calls are coming from. The people who say that it's racism in the justice system, do they think that 911 calls are evenly distributed across the city and the police are ignoring the ones that come from white neighborhoods? Because that doesn't sound like anti-Black racism. That sounds like anti-white racism. It sounds like, in that case, they're prioritizing Black victims. So clearly that's not what's happening. That's an absurd implication. It's an absurd inference to make, but it's the only one you can make, because you search for racism as the explanation. I mean, racist attitudes as the explanation to all this, and it's very hard to find. What progressives should be much more honest about is that crime and high crime rates are the predictable result of several social dysfunctions that conservatives have been blue in the face talking about since, and Democrats used to talk about it too, which are the social dysfunctions that arise from the progressive welfare state, the breakdown of the family, the flight from the labor market, the cycles of dependency. All of these things are highly correlated with high crime rates, and they are not the result of racist attitudes. They are the result of the progressive welfare state, and they were predicted at the time.
Yeah, but to talk about that and to grapple with the causes as opposed to just looking at the raw numbers and saying, well, you know, we have disproportionate numbers of black men being arrested or disproportionate numbers of black men having violent encounters with the police. It must be racism in the Justice Department. It must be racism in our police departments. To grapple with what you're talking about requires something that costs a lot for progressives to talk about, because it requires them to weigh the policies that they have been advocating for generations now on their merits, and it calls into question their entire policy agenda right now, because the policy proposals you hear coming out of the Democratic Party, policies you hear from Joe Biden, from Kamala Harris, from all the other candidates are not.
It would make it all worse.
Yeah, they're not changing course from this. They are just further. Right. They're more extreme iterations of the same kinds of policies that have produced these outcomes, and these outcomes with really obvious racial disparities. And you see that especially in these cities that have had all these problems this summer.
Yeah. Look, I mean, we know, you know, the political science literature is very rich with examples of how government programs have unintended consequences. I apologize. I live under a helicopter superhighway in Washington, D.C. So that's one of the maybe Marine ones flying overhead. But anyway, I apologize for that. You know, the books by prominent Democrats like Peter Schuck at Yale University, Why Government Fails So Often. We know that government programs have lots of unintended consequences. We know that government programs suffer from mistargeted benefits, perverse incentives, and all of these things. And it's an attribute of a lot of progressive programs which are, just because they tend to be very very heavy-handed and interventionist, that the cure is sometimes worse than the disease. But in this particular situation, in many ways, the cure is the disease.
Yeah.
In many ways, you know, they're talking about racist attitudes and white supremacists and race. I don't know anybody who's a white supremacist. I don't think anybody I know knows a single white supremacist. There haven't been white supremacists in this country for 50 years, as far as I can tell. And they're certainly not in charge of the democratically controlled police department of the democratically controlled government of Minneapolis in the democratically controlled state of Minnesota,
right,
which has never had white supremacists, who always fought on the side of the Union and have always been anti-segregation and so forth, and have always believed in civil rights. So clearly the problems here are arising from the social dysfunctions of the welfare state that progressives refuse to acknowledge. I mean, it seems to be for some reason, it seems to be a fundamental aspect of the progressive worldview that requires judging policies by their intentions instead of their results. And when you bring up the results of a program that is otherwise has beautiful intentions, you do so at risk to your reputation and potentially even your professional career, because they will call you racist just for pointing out that their own programs, which they proposed and enacted in the face of predictions that they would have these exact results. When you show them evidence of the results, you're a racist. And so it's a very unserious way of having a discussion, and it calls into question how much these people really care about Black people. I mean, I was visiting friends recently in Highland Park, Illinois. It's a very rich suburb of Illinois. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, of Chicago. It's a place where I looked a little while ago. The median house value is $1.7 million. The median household income is $150,000 a year. Median. And all of these all of these houses had Black Lives Matter signs, and they're beautiful, and the lawns that have been beautifully manicured by Mexican workers, and Black Lives Matter signs in the windows that are beautifully polished by the Honduran maid or whatever, or the Jamaican maid. And of course, the reason why these people have not changed anything about anything that they do. They're not. It's not like they're not giving into any of the BLM organizers' demands, right? They're not instituting racial quotas in their workplaces. They're not doing any of the other. They're not contributing 1.5% of their gross annual income to BLM organizations, which is the shakedown that BLM is doing to a lot of downtown businesses across the country. They don't intend to do any of this stuff. They don't even intend to do without police services when they need them.
Right.
They're happy to vote in favor of defunding the police in poor neighborhoods because I suspect because they have literally never worried about crime and don't know what it's like to be afraid of your neighbors.
And they don't interact with the police. Like, they don't rely on the police the way people in crime-ridden neighborhoods interact with and rely on the police.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
So let me ask you this: what do you think? And maybe there's no answer to this question, but because I'm thinking about this in terms of 2020, and even in terms of 2016, and kind of the essentially the breakdown of our two major political parties, which I think we saw the GOP kind of break down and form a new coalition around Trump with some new voters in 2016. I think the Democrats very much want to bring back the old Obama coalition, but I don't think they're going to, in part because I think they have decided there was a lot of Obama voters who voted for Trump, and that, what gave Obama the victory was a bunch of white voters, white working class voters in the northern states, non-college educated whites. Democrats aren't really vying for those votes.
What gave Trump the victory?
What gave Trump and Obama the victory? Yeah. Obama won a remarkable number of white votes from non-college educated people in northern states, in key states. What I'm wondering is, what would it take for the Democrats to do what you're talking about and to actually examine their policies and grapple with, in an honest way, the real roots of these problems and maybe re-examine them? Would it take the flight of black voters from the Democratic Party? Would it take another national electoral loss? Or are they so ideologically committed that no amount of defeat and no amount of failure from a policy perspective will ever force them to change their mind or rethink this?
I actually think that I have a lot more faith in the Black community than Democratic leaders do. I think that the Black community has a lot of its destiny in its own hands and can do a lot of things to change, and Black leaders can do a lot of things to change the circumstances surrounding this, and many of them have tried. I mean, if you think about the complaints that you hear from not just conservatives like Thomas Sowell, but even people out on the fringe like Louis Farrakhan. I mean, there's plenty of Black leaders who point out that one of the most offensive things about the democratic progressive welfare state is how paternalistic it is, and how it seeks to create not just economic dependency, but also a really insidious kind of political dependency that implies that Blacks are powerless to improve their own fate, that their welfare depends on the benevolence of white Democrats. I mean, that, by the way, hasn't changed in 150 years. Yeah. I mean, the Democrats have been pushing that line, the line of the benevolent master, or the line of the benevolent white Democratic leadership consistently for 150 years, and in a way, they're still pushing it now.
Right.
And so I think that it's being honest about that, being honest about being honest about the consequences, the real world consequences of the policies that they've put in place, is something that will flow a lot more easily when hopefully in the future, increasing numbers of Black leaders point out the hypocrisy, unintentional hypocrisy. I mean, it's with the best of intentions, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And when the more and more Black leaders stand up to point out the hypocrisy and the tragic unintended consequences of what the Democrats have done for now several generations, it's going to become much easier for Democrats to talk about it now. Because I'll tell you one thing, it has never been harder to talk about it for a Democrat than it is now.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think back to 1965, predictions about how poorly the welfare state could turn out were being made by people in Lyndon Johnson's own cabinet, including the Assistant Secretary of Labor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was later to become a Democratic senator. In 1965, in the so-called Moynihan Report, Daniel Patrick Moynihan predicted that all of this stuff was going to happen.
Yep.
If a Democratic senator were to come out now and say, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was right, look at all of the problems that have arisen inside of the Black community because of welfare, he'd be chased out of the party as a racist and white supremacist.
Right, right. Yeah, there's a kind of closure there among the Democrats that, and I think that it may end up costing them, and maybe it costs them enough that they reckon with it. But the ascendant wing, the ascendant forces in the Democratic Party are the AOCs and the Black Lives Matter left, and they cannot have this discussion. Like, they would not even be able to have the discussion we're having right now. They probably literally, and we've seen footage of this from Black Lives Matter protests, like cover their ears and scream, that you're being violent towards them, that they're not safe in this conversation.
Yeah, right.
Which is crazy. But the other thing that we've seen that goes to your point about Highland Park in Chicago is the number of times we've seen footage of these Black Lives Matter protests where the most hysterical and virulent of the protesters are these young white women who are presumably, college educated,
dressed in Lululemon, by the way.
So upper middle class white women who are in some cases screaming in the face of Black cops. And it's
with my own eyes here in DC. I mean,
yeah. So and we're through the looking glass now. So that you could not think of a better image of the kind of paternalism and really condescension that you're describing. This is like if you wanted to come up with a visual meme of what these democratic policies have done over the years, over the generations, it would be a 25-year-old college educated white woman in Lululemon screaming in the face of a Black cop that he's racist. And I think more and more ordinary Americans are starting to see this, partly because there's more images out there now than there used to be. And so that brings more attention to police violence, maybe, as it should, but it also brings more attention to just the absolute hypocrisy and paternalism of the left. And one of the things I think we have to do, and what you did in this article, and I believe that you're writing about this now in more depth, is connect that paternalism, connect that hypocrisy to the policies themselves that we've all kind of just come to accept on a bipartisan basis. Like, we've just come to accept the welfare state as a permanent feature of American life, and apparently to accept its long-term consequences, which disproportionately affect, to the great, in a very detrimental way, the Black community specifically.
Yeah, and there's, like I said, conservatives are blue in the face talking about the failures of the welfare state. They continue to do it now, even though they get branded as racist or whatever for pointing it out. But the failures of the welfare state, most of them are just obvious. I mean, it screams to high heaven. But there are aspects of this that are not so obvious. There are aspects of this that really, some of the most terrible aspects of it emerge only after you really look at it for a long time and think about it carefully. One of them is, let's go back to what Lyndon Johnson said at the dawn of the Great Society's welfare programs. He pledged at one point that, I mean, in his conception, these programs were clearly temporary. They were being put in place, to use his words, to help people lift themselves out of poverty. I think that those were almost his exact words.
And join in the mainstream of American society.
Right.
Yeah.
So to the extent that Lyndon Johnson's idea was to increase opportunities for social mobility through these welfare programs, they very clearly have failed. They very clearly accomplished exactly the opposite of that. And the way that they accomplish the opposite of that is by drawing people away from the productive labor force. I mean, they draw not just, I mean, it's obviously the impact falls disproportionately on blacks, but basically the way that these programs are structured is that they draw the bottom quintile, the bottom 20% in terms of skills, right? And if you arrange the labor force by skill level, the bottom fifth just get pulled straight out of the productive economy, which is in a way how they have their benefits. That's how you create a shortage of labor at the bottom end of the labor pool, which is why these rich Democrats in Highland Park are paying illegal immigrants to do the work that they've made it essentially impossible for US citizens to do, right, through the welfare program. And so they, in essence, all of these poor people, disproportionately, again, minorities, are cut off from the productive labor force, which cuts them off from the most valuable avenue for social upward mobility that we have outside of the school system, and the single most valuable one for adults. And so what is the result of that? Well, one result of that is that there are no black people living in the nice areas of Highland Park. So we still live in an era of segregation.
Right.
And now the segregation is being produced by some of the very programs that were supposed to eliminate segregation.
Right.
And I think it's very important to look back at this and say, you know, it's so tragic, because obviously what Lyndon Johnson wanted to do, obviously what John F. Kennedy wanted to do, who came up with many of these ideas, obviously what that generation of Democrats wanted to do was to end the despicable legacy of segregation that Democrats had held on to at the state and local level for 100 years since the Civil War. And in many respects, the Civil Rights Movement accomplished that. I mean, the Civil Rights Movement did away with state and local formal legal segregation.
Right.
But then they came in and unbelievably, with a series of welfare programs, ended up essentially paying for people to segregate themselves.
Right.
And so poor people have segregated, the poorest of the poor have segregated themselves. They don't participate in the productive economy. They don't get out of that situation. The social mobility is extremely limited for the people at the bottom end of the skill level, because they're not learning on the job. They're not learning skills that would make them more productive the way the rest of us do.
Right.
I mean, if you think about the hypocrisy of, for example, let's just end with one example if we're running out of time.
Sure.
I mean, I keep going back to the when we worked again at Texas Public Policy Foundation, all of these 501c3s use a lot of interns. These rich Democrats in Highland Park are perfectly happy for their children to work for free in congressmen's offices or at think tanks so that they can learn valuable skills, which they freely admit they do not have on graduating from pricey Northwestern University or whatever. But if a poor person wants to get their child a internship at the Walmart, they're protected from that, right? And so the Democrats really think that by depriving poor people of the opportunities that they make sure their children have, they're protecting poor people.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I'm not prepared to call it hypocrisy, but incoherent, it definitely is.
Well, and you also have other examples of that right now in California. The push to eliminate the gig economy, which for a lot of people, driving Uber and Lyfts is a way to supplement their income, but their betters in the California Assembly are protecting them from that work, and the net result is Uber and Lyft is going to leave the state, and so no one will drive for Uber and Lyft anymore.
So there was actually an extended report on this today in National Public Radio's weekend edition Saturday, I guess, or weekend edition, where they're interviewing several lawmakers, and of course, NPR in the service of balance only presents various democratic points of view on the situation. But luckily, they talked to one of the Uber drivers, and the Uber driver says, so actually one of the policy people that they talked to said, well, it turns out that sometimes the workers object to this because they end up getting paid less, as if it was this great discovery that channeling, that requiring health benefits or whatever is going to lower the cash compensation. I mean, it's incredible. But then they talk to an actual worker, and the worker saying, this is my only job. I mean, if they push this through, I'm going to have to move to another state. Yeah. And they think that it's a matter, I mean, and someone like Ilhan Omar listens to that worker and says, oh, how tragic that they don't have my level of education and don't realize how they're being exploited within a system of oppression, blah, blah, blah. And she thinks, they think that they have this erudite, and again, it goes back to the paternalistic worldview. They think that their erudition allows them to know what's better for these people than the people that they're trying to help. Yeah. And I just think it's something, I think that it's something that, free market conservatives, it's definitely true, have failed with the Paul Ryan message of like, let's lower taxes and let's do these things that are sensible for everybody. I think it's very important for conservatives to start connecting with the communities of color and disadvantaged communities, because we all care. I mean, the thing about Black Lives Matter is that Black Lives Matter to all of us. Yeah. Right? Black lives matter to you. They matter to me. They matter. We all care. Right. I mean, there are people there are real racists out there, I'm sure, who don't care. But I mean, broadly speaking, the idea that Black Lives Matters is a broadly bipartisan one. Yeah. And I personally spend a lot of time working, and I know that you do too, on how to fix our system of laws and how to fix our regulation so that people benefit, in particular, the people who need help the most. So we care about these people. And it's just a matter of connecting with them so that we can bring their stories to light, so that we can explain our policies in terms of their stories. That's right. Because right now it looks like the only people advocating for them are the Democrats in Highland Park and these Marxist activists at the top of the BLM organization. And it's all an elaborate dramatization of the 3/5 clause at a certain point. Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to leave it there. Mario, thanks for joining us. You can follow Mario Loyola on Twitter at Mario A Loyola. That's Mario _A_ Loyola, I believe. And he is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, writes occasionally for National Review and The Atlantic and a number of other publications. We're happy to have him today. Hopefully we can continue this conversation on a future edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, John Davidson, political editor at The Federalist. Until next time, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.